I'm the Program and Evaluation Manager at JPRO Network. JPRO is the organization that is by, of, and for the approximately 100,000 people who work at Jewish organizations across the United States and Canada. We have closed captioning available for this session. There are instructions being put in the chat on how you can access it, and there is a CC button on the bottom of your screen. Our program today is also being recorded, and hopefully, barring any technical difficulties, will be posted to our YouTube channel. Today's program is one of 2 free election-related programs that we're offering. The other will be next Thursday, November 5th, to mark the time between Election Day and Shabbat. Speakers include Dr. Erica Brown, Shahana McKinney-Baldin, Idit Klein, and William Daroff. More information can be found on our website. We know that national politics can be a polarizing issue with heightened emotions. Today's program is a nonpartisan program that does not seek to promote any one particular perspective over another. As a participant in this program, we ask you to agree to refrain from name calling, speaking in generalizations, and promoting stereotypes. If you do not comply with these guidelines, you will be removed from the session. I am delighted to introduce Aaron Dorfman, President of the Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah, who will speak to us today about Free&Fair, their initiative to provide the Jewish community with informative, nonpartisan resources to support conversation, safety, and action during this tumultuous election season. Aaron?
Thanks so much, Laura, and thanks to Ilana and the whole JPRO team for inviting me to this conversation. We're gonna start with a little learning together, but before I do that, I'd love for everybody to take a minute and write into the chat a thing that you're worried about vis-a-vis this year's U.S. elections. Something. Post-election violence, the outcome in the day after, violence, Bush v. Gore but messier, riots, right of center provoked violence and left of center responses, lack of a definitive outcome, power transition, the Supreme Court making the final decision, a peaceful transition of power if the outcome warrants it, post-election depression, violence. Yeah. I want to acknowledge and recognize that these are heavy things. These are actually things that show up on the worry lists of people in countries around the world who face election threats that are unlike those that we face in the United States, have faced in the United States historically. And so in hard ways, we're in good company. And there are a lot of things that we can learn from those other countries and other places that have dealt with these issues. But I want to acknowledge like the gravity and weightiness of this. So what I'm going to start with is a very short kind of presentation on a couple of texts. We have a rich tradition in the Jewish community of studying texts. These are not Jewish texts, although one of them at least is written by someone Jewish, that are reflections on the context, the election context that we're in. And I've asked, I've kind of pre-gamed this with a couple of people who are on the call, and I'm going to ask I'm going to ask one of them to read each of these 2 texts. If you'll give me a moment to share my screen, which oddly, I'm having a hard time selecting. Hold on one moment. There we go. Great. So Rebecca Youngerman, will you read this text, and I'll just call everyone's attention to the questions at the bottom of the text that we'll take a few kind of responses to after Rebecca reads the text.
The coming crisis of legitimacy. A new poll by the Campaign Legal Center and Protect Democracy provides a preliminary answer. A clear majority of Americans, including 6 out of every 10 Republicans, said that they were confident that votes for president in November will be counted fairly, accurately, and securely. But crucially, confidence in the election is strongly conditional on its outcome. Only 1 in 3 Americans who plan to vote for Trump said that if Joe Biden is declared the victor, that it would be because he receives more votes than Donald Trump. More than 2 in 5 said it would be because voting systems are rigged and voter fraud is committed. What most surprised me about the poll, though, is that many Biden supporters also said that they would doubt the validity of the election if they didn't like the outcome. Just 1 in 5 supporters said that a win by Trump would be because he received more votes than Biden. Nearly 2 in 3 said it would be due to voter suppression and foreign interference. These findings are a dark sign of what awaits us come November. Whether Biden or Trump emerges as the winner, millions of Americans will likely believe that their candidate was robbed.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you.
So I'm curious, how, if at all, are the issues that Yasha Monk, who's a scholar of democracy, how are these things playing out in your community? Is this is this a conversation topic? Are there questions among the people that you work with or in your community? And I'm asking this because of the question of the large group. How are these things playing out, and what feels like it's at stake in your community? And because I'm sharing full screen, I can't actually see everybody. Oh, maybe I can. Can I do this? Yeah, kind of, sort of. So I'll invite people to go off mute and share a response. And we'll take 2 or 3, and then we'll shift to a next text.
Sure, I'll step into that one. I'm Rabbi Ron Simons from the JCC of Greater Pittsburgh.
Hi, Ron.
And the Carter Center reached out to us, identifying Pittsburgh of one of 20 cities where they fear that there'll be violence. Because of the history of protests on both sides and because of the nature of being a blue island in a Red Sea. So we're working on it. We had 80 or so interfaith clergy on a call together. We have now a core group that's reaching out to non-religious leaders in the community, sports figures and whatnot, to start recording messages or getting ready for press conferences and the like. People that aren't on the normal left of center side that we would normally reach out to, but on the other side to say violence is violence.
Great. Rabbi Simons, thank you. Anybody else?
I'll speak. Rebecca Youngerman, I am here in Madison, Wisconsin, which, if you know Madison, it's sort of the blueberry amongst a very, very red state, and a lot of crazy things are happening here. I will also recognize Wisconsin among, I think it's the 5 states that are, particularly prevalent to militia activity based on what has happened and what will happen. And where this conversation is really on the minds, I think, of many people informally here, just in terms of what will happen in Madison, which normally I wouldn't worry about, but what we saw happen earlier in the summer and what that means. I will honestly say, for particularly related to guns, both on the left and on the right. So that's lingering particularly.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. One more, anybody else?
I'm also Rebecca, but I'm Rebecca Malkin. I'm from Temple Sinai and also in Pittsburgh. And I would just like to echo what the other Rebecca said. I think that's kind of the biggest concern is certainly, like, from a violence perspective, guns, and particularly being from Pittsburgh, that's something I'm ultra sensitive to. And definitely something that's like a major concern for me. I guess another major concern is also if there is a need for protest or things of that nature, like of a peaceful nature, the concern about spread of COVID-19 through that. You know, like I want to be able to exercise my rights, but I also have a partner who works with people who are at very high risk. And so I worry that if I can't protest because of concerns about that, will my voice not be heard? That kind of thing.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Rebecca. All right, we're gonna shift to another text, and actually, like all three of the people who responded to this one, which is primarily a question, primarily a text about electoral legitimacy, alluded to violence, and that was a topic that came up in the initial chats as well. And this next text, slightly longer, speaks very specifically to that. And I've asked Judith Belasco to read this next text.
Thanks. U.S. Political Violence Background Brief by Project Over Zero. Importantly, violence is also not the purview of one side of the aisle. While right-wing violence began to rise in 2012 and now comprises 33% of U.S. political violence according to the Global Terrorism Database, making it a greater threat than jihadi terror, left-wing terrorism comprises about 13% of U.S. cases. Before the 2018 midterm, gunshots were fired at a Republican Party office in Florida. In 2016, the year the Bernie Sanders supporter shot a member of Congress, 20 police officers were targeted in ambush-style killings. We know from examples overseas that violence is rarely contained to one side of a divide, but spreads in tit-for-tat retaliatory cycles. It can also spill over from political to criminal and even interpersonal violence, with homicide rates rising in countries where political violence has become more acceptable. The small amount of research on political violence in America suggests that violent predilections exist among partisans of both stripe. A fifth of Democrats polled and 15% of Republicans believe that we'd be better off as a country if large numbers of the opposing party just died. Nearly a quarter of Republicans and 17% of Democrats felt that it was sometimes acceptable to send threatening messages to public officials. If the opposing party wins the 2020 election, 18% of Democrats and 13% of Republicans feel violence would be justified. Interestingly, partisans felt more justified in using violence when told their candidate was likely to win. We know from other countries that those that have experienced political violence in the past are most at risk of its return. America is one such country. For over half a century, Southern Democrats maintained a Jim Crow system upheld by laws and interpersonal violence. In the 1960s and 70s, violence emanated largely from the left, but the mayhem of these eras continued long after, rippling through decades of increased poverty, segregation, and urban blight.
Thank you, Judith. Sort of. Judith and I had a nice email exchange about this earlier, talking about with deep gratitude to her for giving voice to this very hard stuff. So again, I'm curious about the extent to which the data here, the observations being made in this brief, resonate for you in the context of your community, and if so, how you or your community are responding. So again, I'll take a couple, two or three.
I can speak.
Yeah, Jenny.
You know, I don't want to say we've been subject to political violence, but I work for the Lippman Kanfer Foundation, and we've certainly been at the heart of some local politics. We house this safe parking. Jewish Family Service runs a safe parking program for people living in their cars on our property, and it's a very big issue in our current local election. And certainly the threats of neighbors saying we need to carry guns now, we don't know what's happening over there, drones being flown over the property at night. So while I think there's a lot of fears about post-election violence on a national level, I think locally because of we're sort of at the epicenter of a really hot button issue in our community, it feels scary. I mean, what we've done, we've upped our security, but it definitely leaves us feeling quite vulnerable.
Yeah. Thanks, Jenny. Other thoughts or responses to this in the context of political violence or other threats of violence? And Jenny, I think it's an interesting question, the extent to which the thing you're talking about might be qualified as political violence or the risk of it. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing and talk a little bit about the project, the Free and Fair campaign, which we at Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah have launched, which is in part a response to these dynamics described in these two articles and a lot of other things. And then we'll pivot, I think, hopefully quickly into more conversation and more questions. By way of background, Lippman Kanfer Foundation for Living Torah has as its mission helping people apply Jewish wisdom to universal human questions, which means that we try to help organizations and people bring the Jewish wisdom tradition to bear on universal questions like end-of-life issues, addiction and recovery, parenting, climate change, social justice, racial justice, and so on. And since the 2016 election, for, I think, obvious reasons, we've been working at the intersection of Judaism and American democracy. How can the Jewish wisdom tradition inform and support a robust kind of Jewish engagement with American democracy in particular? So the campaign that I'm about to describe is a natural outgrowth of that longstanding commitment. The principles that form the bedrock of our work in this area are three. First, a deep commitment to the rule of law. Second, a commitment to nonviolence. And third, a commitment to a free and fair election in which everyone can vote and every vote is counted. And I think like all of you, we've been increasingly concerned over the last several months about potential threats to the legitimacy of this year's election. Questions about whether the post office is going to have the capacity or the inclination to deliver mail-in ballots, questions about increasing potential for political violence, questions about delegitimization of the outcome of the election, whether the rules for the election will change at the last minute or even based on the Supreme Court decisions in the last couple of days after the last minute. And all of this kind of unfolding against the backdrop of a pandemic that's making the rules around voting and the rules around elections extremely unclear. So as we've learned more about the complexity of this particular election cycle, it became clear to us that religious leaders, along with local elected officials, business leaders, entertainment figures, law enforcement, and the media, have the potential to play a critical role as part of the American civil society infrastructure, educating and preparing their communities in the lead up to Election Day and potentially mobilizing their communities in the event of some kind of actual crisis. So given our work at the intersection of the Jewish and democracy spaces, we felt that we were well positioned to play a connector role in this context. Beginning about 6 weeks ago now, early mid-September, we held a series of convenings among the heads of about 20 American Jewish organizations to talk about what they and their stakeholders need or needed. These were mostly organizations that had memberships of Jewish leaders. So the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America, the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality, then the ARC. In many cases, they were already political organizations that engaged in politics, either from a progressive vantage point or from a sort of centrist kind of bipartisan standpoint. But in a lot of cases, they were organizations that are deeply apolitical. Institute for Jewish Spirituality, Hadar, organizations for which moving into this space felt uncomfortable and unfamiliar, but also really necessary in this moment because of the kinds of questions and challenges that their members, the rabbis and other Jewish clergy and other leaders were confronting. So these consultations led us to launch this mini campaign, which we're calling Free and Fair, and which has 3 areas of focus. First, we have been, over the last month, disseminating, kind of curating and disseminating resources to a list of now about 400 leaders of Jewish organizations. We're also putting them up on a website that was in the email that went out in advance of this session, and we'll repeat, I think, tomorrow. That contains kind of well-curated, nonpartisan information about how to vote, about what the electoral process looks like, about what a contested election, how a contested election might unfold, about the process that gets us from the end of the end of balloting on November 3rd through the certification of state results to the convening of the Electoral College and the ultimate inauguration of either a new president's term or the continuation of the current president's second term into the second term. The second kind of pillar of the campaign has been surfacing and sponsoring trainings and other resources tailored specifically for Jewish leaders and clergy. So for example, last week we sponsored 2 trainings, one by an organization called Boulder Advocacy, which helps 501c3 organizations know what they can and can't do and say in the context of an election, given their 501c3 status. And we've put some of the resources from that training up on the Free and Fair website. We also hosted a training by an organization called Project Over Zero that focuses on political violence to talk with Jewish clergy and other leaders about how to prepare for, plan for, and mitigate political violence in the context of an election. And the recording of that training is up on our website as well. And then the third pillar of the campaign, which really came to us because of the convenings that we hosted, a broad consensus among the leaders that we spoke with said, we need a call to action. It's really important for us to learn good information and be able to share that information with our constituents and counter disinformation that we hear. But I got to have something to do. And so we, almost on a lark, we put out a call to Jewish organizations to close on Election Day. We're one of the only, the United States is one of the only democracies in the world that doesn't close for business on Election Day, that doesn't hold its election on a weekend or another day that's a national holiday. We think that's a little crazy. And we saw this as an opportunity to do a few things. One is to foreground a Jewish commitment to the democratic enterprise, to have the Jewish community come together and make a statement about how important our role is in the civic fabric of this country. The second is to make sure that the employees of Jewish organizations would have a chance to vote, right? We've been seeing over the last few weeks 5-hour lines in Georgia and Texas and embarrassingly New York for people to vote. And we know that while probably more than half of all votes will be cast before Election Day, close to half will need to be cast on Election Day. And we wanted to be sure that, that employees of Jewish organizations could vote. And the third was that we really wanted to encourage the employees of Jewish organizations to engage in the electoral process, to participate actively in civic engagement and support of the right to vote for everyone in this country, whether by doing election poll monitoring or poll working, or providing support to people waiting in those long lines, engaging in nonpartisan get out the vote efforts, and so on. We're delighted that JPRO has been one of the kind of pledge signers onto the campaign. We're now up to 75 organizations across the country, across the denominational spectrum, representing now close to 2,200 employees of Jewish organizations that will be closed on Tuesday so that their staff can vote and can participate actively in the political process. So that's the campaign. That's how we're trying to respond to this. I will say, as I've said in several conversations like this in other contexts, I dearly hope that this campaign is a huge waste of time and money, and that we arrive sometime shortly after November 3rd, having completed a free, fair, and decisive election that results in either the peaceful continuation of power or a peaceful transfer of power. That is my most fervent hope. But either way, we're feeling really inspired by the way that the Jewish community is stepping up and stepping into an active role in the civic life of this country. I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to engage in conversation.
Please feel free to unmute yourselves or type your questions for Aaron in the chat.
Right. I unmuted. I didn't raise my hand. I could have raised my hand.
Either way, Judith.
It's just incredibly impressive how much has been done. So I'm still going to ask one of those end questions.
Yeah.
So something I've been thinking about is in relation to staff. And, I work at a very small organization, but we still represent Pittsburgh and Chicago and Cleveland and Philadelphia. And where I would also put in the apolitical category, yet this I would say is up for everyone in very considerable ways. And I'm just curious from the conversations that you've had broadly with leaders and been thinking about this, just trying to navigate the fact that it's a complex time for staff, and giving what a day off is one thing, but we also have all the days leading up to it and whatever we imagine in the days after. So I'm just curious how any thoughts that have been shared or ways to help to hold that space.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, a great observation, and it is not lost on me or us at all that this is just another layer of anxiety in the context of a year that has been one relentless battering ram of sources of anxiety after another. Right, we're living through the first global pandemic of this scale in 100 years. We are reeling from incredibly complex reckoning with racial justice and racial injustice in this country that has rippled around the world. And we're dealing with the most polarizing political presidential election in generations. So I think all of those things are true, and all those things are manifesting in our families. There's an article in the Times this morning, I think, about intermarriages, right? Marriages between Democrats and Republicans, and how those people are coping. So I think that in the conversations that we've had, different organizations are managing and navigating these things differently. I think some of the lessons we learned in the early days of the COVID pandemic also play out. Flexibility for staff to like process and manage the things that they need to process and manage. Spaces for them to talk about those things or not. I was just talking to someone about a plan for a rabbi about a plan for her synagogue to have. She had great language for it, and I'm not going to remember it, but meetings of those who are distressed and those who are delighted separately after the election, and then meetings of those two groups together. But first, a meeting of the distressed and a meeting of the delighted, so that they have time to kind of process and recognize and remember, like, be in those spaces together. And then remember that, oh yes, there is another group that is meeting, and those people are part of this community also, and we need to figure out how to re-engage with them. So I think that there are a lot of tools. I know that Institute for Jewish Spirituality, which I mentioned, has been leading a lot of kind of grounding and centering spiritual practice, reconstructing Judaism through its ritual well and reset programming has been leaning into a lot of those things. So I'd call people's attention to those resources as mechanisms for supporting and engaging staff in navigating these difficult times. There's just a smattering of suggestions. Carol, please.
Hi, thank you. You mentioned mobilizing communities in crisis in post-election.
Yeah.
And could you expand a little bit on that as how and exactly what? Because we're struggling with that here. I'm at Temple Sinai, DC.
Yeah. Look, I think that no matter what happens on Tuesday or in the days following, right, we're confronting a situation, given the intense polarization of this election season and of this kind of political moment, right? Which, when I say moment, I'm thinking about that very expansively, where somewhere between 40 and 60% of Americans are going to be devastated by the results of next week's election. And somewhere between 20 and 80% of American Jews are going to be devastated by the results of next week's election. And one of the great genius things about the American democratic system is the legitimization of the cri de coeur, right? Like the protest. I am angry. I am frustrated. I do not like the way this thing is happening, and my right to express that is consecrated in the Bill of Rights. And leaning into that as a vehicle, both for the expression of that frustration and anger or delight, right? Like the right to free assembly, the right to peacefully give voice to that, I think is something that we need, we as a faith community, as a Jewish community, should be endorsing, embracing, and supporting. Again, for everybody, the people who are angry, the people who are thrilled, and focusing less on whether that should happen and more on how it should happen. And how it should happen is peacefully, non-violently, in a way that does not dehumanize the other, which is like both antithetical to, I think, almost inarguable values in Judaism, but also antithetical to the way that this country operates and should, when it's, when it is living up to its the better angels of its nature. So when I say public protest, public voice, I think that's the thing that I'm talking about.
But that's internally, right? I mean, that's what I'm hearing from you. And so we are kind of worried about externally what might happen and where we are and how we cope and what can we tell our congregants if, God forbid, such a thing should happen here in Washington, D.C. area, which it probably will. Any thoughts?
When you say such a thing, what do you mean?
People here are concerned about violence in the Washington, D.C. area. And as a congregation, obviously you respond, saying it should be peaceful, but we're just concerned and wondering what kind of response we can make.
Yeah, so I'll speak about that in sort of three ways. One is there are obviously very, very important, what I would call hard security issues for Jewish communities, right? Not only Jewish communities, but I'll speak about them in the context of Jewish communities. Jewish institutions that are place-based have a unique set of vulnerabilities and risk factors that they need to take into consideration in the context of potential violence, particularly electoral violence, where some of the actors are anti-Semitic, right? That's like out in the world. And luckily, Jewish Federations of North America and the Secure Communities Network has a machinery and an apparatus for addressing that. And I urge everyone who is responsible for a place-based Jewish community to be in contact with JFNA and with SCAN to make sure that you're using those resources as effectively as possible. The second thing is, and this is what I would call soft security issues. These are the ones that the training that we hosted last week from Project Over Zero spoke to, which is, how do you create a resilient community response in the face of potential violence? And I strongly encourage people to watch the 40-minute or so presentation that Rachel Brown gave on that webinar last week, and also to access the toolkit that we've put onto the Free&Fair website about how to create resiliency in your community. And what it is primarily about is preparation, communication, and network activation, right? The way that communities make themselves resilient in advance of potential violence is by ensuring that they have the communication plans in place so that they're networked with each other. Their thick, close networks are well kind of lubricated and attuned, so people know who to call, they know who they're going to be getting information from, and that the networks that each institution is part of with other faith communities, with other community institutions, with civil society, with elected officials, with the local police chief, are activated and ready so that people are part of that kind of thick network. My mother-in-law is a rabbi in White Plains. She has a direct line based on 35 years worth of relationship building and communication with the local sheriff, the local police chief, the mayor, making sure that your first call to those people and institutions isn't on Wednesday, November 4th, but is today, tomorrow, or Monday, so that those systems are in place and those relationships are activated. And then the last piece of this, I think, is really a pastoral one, right? Which is what is the messaging that we as Jewish leaders should be prepared to share when and if there are instances of violence. And I will be the first to admit this is not my area of expertise. Thankfully, there are thousands of rabbis and Jewish social workers and people who are part of the Network for Jewish Human Service Agencies who are well prepared for those kinds of eventualities, unfortunately well prepared. And again, I would lean into connections with those people to talk about how you can support your community and message your community in the event that those things happen. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
Can you talk about some of the Jewish wisdom resources that you mentioned?
Sure. I'll call your attention to a few things. Actually, maybe I'll share a document with the JPRO team to send out after the call. We at the foundation have prepared a set of texts, a combination, actually a mix of Jewish texts and texts from the democratic tradition to talk about the importance of voting and the importance of kind of the consultation with the community and community participation in civic life, which I'm happy to share with you. I'd also call folks' attention, and we can share the link for this also, to the Rabbinical Assembly of the Conservative Movement adopted a resolution a week and a half ago in support of voting in the 2020 election, and it is steeped in kind of Jewish text, tradition, and wisdom. And I'm going to go like one sort of meta step in a slightly different direction from the Jewish text direction. I think there's a powerful argument to be made that's less about our textual tradition, right? Which I would never argue that Jewish wisdom leads inexorably to democracy, right? I don't think that's like a false claim. But I would say that American Judaism, the vibrancy of American Judaism, and frankly, I'll say the vibrancy of North American Judaism is at least as much due to the vibrancy of democracy in North America as it is due to the vibrancy of Judaism. We have invented something here. We have created something here that is unique in the history of the Jewish people. It's uniquely different from 15th century Spanish Judaism or 18th century Polish Judaism or 20th century Israeli Judaism. And that's a product of American North American democratic civil society. And our ability to thrive in this environment, to create we have Jewish organizations that are focused on promoting veganism, right? We have Jewish organizations that are promoting, thank goodness we have Jewish organizations that are focused on sexual harassment in the Jewish workplace. We have Jewish organizations that are focused on racial justice and climate change and parenting and end-of-life issues and addiction and recovery. That is a kind of vibrancy to Jewish community that is a product of our inhabiting rich, dynamic, vibrant democracies. So I would say that there's a historical case to be made for why Jewish wisdom leads in this direction. And that's often where I sort of ground this, from history as opposed to from text, but I will share text as well. Other questions or concerns?
I can't hear you, Laura. It doesn't look like you're muted, but I can't hear you. I don't know if others can. No, still no.
Laura, you probably are still set to playing audio from your computer, possibly, and not from your microphone.
You can chat in the chat. I don't know, Aaron, if she might be, we're going to direct you. There were a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
I don't know if you got them all, but.
Let's see. What are special challenges of the fact that meeting now means coming together via technology? Judy, I don't totally understand the question. You want to come off of mute and give it over a little more?
Sure. So I've been reflecting a lot about, we are just past the second anniversary of the Tree of Life killing. Yeah. And here in Chicago, where I live, at Beth Emmet, where I belong, we physically came together. And the physically being together was a source of support. It was a way that people could comfort each other. It was a way that I think a big contribution to getting through a hard time. Now that's not possible. So often meeting means meeting like this.
Yes.
And I think that presents special challenges and maybe special responses. And I'm trying to figure out what those special responses might be.
I don't know. Like, I actually don't. I don't have a great answer to that question. I mean, I think that this intermediated communication platform that all of us are kind of coping and dealing with now, going into the 9th month of, certainly exacerbates some of the challenges that we're dealing with in polarization, because it's always easier to dehumanize someone who you only experience in 2 dimensions, right? So I think there's a special kind of challenge and responsibility around that. I wish I had a great answer to the question, but I don't. I'm sorry. I'm going to go to Rebecca's question. Should congregations whose physical locations are polling places do any special preparation beyond what's recommended by the elections board and officials? Rebecca, again, I feel like that's it's above my pay grade on the kind of physical plant security, and I would refer you to SCAN and to JFNA. That I suspect has quite clear guidelines and recommendations around that. But I also think that election boards and officials are thinking about those things, particularly in this year, certainly the ones that with whom I've been in contact. Other questions or thoughts on this topic?
I'll jump in again.
Yeah, sure. And then Alana.
Whether specific to like this topic or even more broadly, I'm curious, as your repository of resources, of ways to engage in like the like breaking down the silos of thinking that have created such a partisan divide. And just, I feel like it's a muscle that needs to be built to better understand each other, and whether maybe it's not this very fraught moment, but in like, or it could be if there's resources about this or in general to be able to just build that muscle, because I think it's an important one, and curious what might be out there.
So I absolutely agree. I think this is, no matter what happens next week, this is like we're going to be dealing with and trying very hard to undo the kind of cycle of polarization and dehumanization that has characterized these past 4, 8, 10, 30 years. So that's a serious project. Now, I think we have some like reasons for hope, and we have some resources. So one, I'll go back to the Jewish wisdom tradition that someone just mentioned. Like, we're the inheritors of a tradition that that makes debate sacred, right? Like, arguing is a holy piece of business in Judaism. Our canonical text is the record of a 500-year series of disagreements that that goes to pains to preserve the losing opinion, right? It is not a triumphalist document. We're not triumphalists. Whatever the decisions were, there's a discourse in Judaism that's about evidence and argument and respect for the fundamental dignity and humanity of the interlocutor. And I think that that's a tremendous, I'm always like a little hesitant about like, where can the Jewish community be a light unto the nations? Like, it always feels a little sanctimonious, but that's like a gift to the world that we really should foreground. And there are some, I'd call your attention to Pardes produced a curriculum a couple of years ago called Machloket Matters, about the value of disagreement and the way to kind of elevate viewpoint diversity and constructive disagreement. I think it's a tremendous resource that people should really like look at and try to take advantage of. And then I think that there is a large network of organizations, many of them quite small, that are focused on how to do this better. Resetting the Table in the Jewish community has made an incredible kind of business out of dealing with this on disagreements among American Jews around Israel and Palestine. They've also actually leaned into the post-2016 political context in the United States, actually are just in the process of rolling out a short film called Purple about a community in Wisconsin where they brought together people who voted for Trump and people who voted for Hillary Clinton to like engage with what that means in a way that was deeply humanizing. If you can find it online, I would strongly encourage checking it out. There's study guide resources associated with it. And there are a number of organizations that are making this part of their business. And I think finding them and building relationships with ones that work for you and your community is a really, really good idea. Ilana.
I'm curious about so thinking about those of us who lead Jewish organizations that are nonpartisan, in the event of a contested election where we're not if the scenario is that it's contested, but there's not violence in sort of that emergency, or if there is a clear outcome, what are your hopes for how we would exercise leadership? Like what leadership behaviors would you want to see from those of us who have the opportunity, who lead communities in some way in those scenarios?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think one of the things that we have learned over the course of these, it's been, I can't believe it's only been like 6 weeks since we started doing this, is how skeptical people are about the genuineness of our nonpartisanness, right? I have found myself having to say with pains, I would dramatically prefer a landslide victory for either candidate to a constitutional crisis. That is absolutely true. That is hard for me. I have a preferred candidate. I work very hard outside of my work life to support a candidate in this election, to support candidates for the Senate and for the House. I have no one who knows me does doubts where my political proclivities are. And I would vastly prefer to lose on all of those and avoid a constitutional crisis. So I think that sort of animating guidance is really, really important for me. I've gotten emails in the last week from people who haven't wanted to sign on to the pledge because they think we're only doing this in 2020. Now, it turns out we did it in 2018. We put out a call in 2018. Nobody paid any attention. We didn't do a very good job. We're doing a better job in 2020. And I'm quite committed to doing this in 2022 and 2024 because this really isn't about a candidate, right? This is or a party. This is about democracy and preserving it against threats of anti-democracy. So I think that's part of the messaging. I think acknowledging and appreciating the despair among the people who have lost, acknowledging and appreciating the delight among the people who have won, having that be totally ecumenical, right? It doesn't matter which party, like that messaging I think is really important. If there are calls on either side for counting to stop before counting has been completed, there need to be equally loud calls against those claims. So I think that, I think all of that is really important. And the last thing I'll say, and this is, I think, just implicit in your question, is I think it is really important for us as a community, and I think that this is happening in a really important and valuable way, to distinguish between partisan and political. Right? Lots of people have said to me, "Oh, but we're not a political organization." You're an organization, you're political, right? If you have to elect board members, you're political. If you have to decide like what time you light candles at your synagogue because of like halachic practice, you're political. If you have to decide which food you're gonna have at the events, you're making, politics is the way that human beings negotiate decisions when they don't always perfectly agree. So we are, all of us, political. All of our organizations are political. Partisan is a very particular thing. It means to support the advantage of a particular candidate or party. And as 501c3 organizations, and even more so as a private foundation, we're not allowed to do that. And that is as it should be, or maybe it isn't, but that is what it is. But to distinguish between the political and the partisan, I think, is really important, and to kind of own the fact that we're part of a rich civil society that is deeply political, and that we have a role to play in ensuring the health, vitality, and kind of robustness of that civil society. It feels really important.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
I think we might have time for one last question before we conclude, if anyone would like to jump in. Okay, doesn't seem like there is another question, but please feel free to jump in as I make a couple of announcements here. First of all, thank you so much, Aaron, for holding the space for us today and for talking about these issues with such a calm, reassuring nature, and sharing many, many resources with us. We will, of course, share those with the group of you tomorrow, hopefully tomorrow, along with the recording for the session. As I mentioned previously, we have another election-related program next Thursday to mark the time between Election Day and Shabbat. And more information can be found on our website. Please also help us spread the word about RISE, which is our initiative to support individuals experiencing unemployment due to COVID. Meditation and peer groups start in the next couple of weeks, and career coaching is available through RISE on an ongoing basis. JPro's program, Well Advised, our free 1-hour advising session, is open to take requests currently. And lastly, registration is also open right now for our upcoming masterclass, Intro to Racial Justice for Jewish Community Professionals. My colleague Erica has been sending you all of these links in the chat, and there's one more for you. If you could please share your feedback on today's session with us, that would be really greatly appreciated. And I'm going to toss it back over to Aaron to see if there are any more final questions from the group and to share any concluding remarks.
I just want to thank you. Really, thanks to the JPro team for teeing up this conversation. Thanks to everyone who joined. Thanks to Judith and Rebecca for reading those really uplifting texts. Appreciate your stepping up in that way. People have asked for a number of things, and I'll make sure to share those with the JPro team so they can go out in an email, I think tomorrow, to the Over Zero training and some other things. I think what I would close with is a question, that you can respond, come off mute and respond, or post something into the chat. Adrienne Marie Brown, who's a writer, an anti-racist writer and feminist writer, talks about like the feeling of wanting to, like, for those of us in the social change world, like take on the whole thing, right? Like, how am I gonna fix elections? How am I gonna solve that? And she says, like, calm down, have a little humility. Just think about what is the one next most elegant step you can take. So I'll pose the question to you all, and again, put it in the chat, or feel free to come off mute and share it. But in the context of supporting democracy in the country that you live in, what's one next elegant step you can take? Trying to have an open mind, modeling civility, reading, breathing and having conversations, listening, sending pizza to the polls with long lines, drawing from Jewish values and a tradition that values diverse opinions, looking at machloket matters, actively listening, being attentive to what's needed of me and us on Wednesday and beyond. Pizza to the polls. I love that initiative. All right. Well, I will close. I've been signing emails to people where I've been encouraging them to be engaged in this year's political cycle. I've been signing them with hope, bolstered by a lot of hard work for a better future for all of us. So I'll leave that as a bracha and a kavanah, a blessing and an intention for the JPro community, for all of you, and a gratitude again for inviting me to this conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Aaron.